Okay everyone, so in this part of the video we're going to modify our diffuse and we'll basically try to convert it into a specular map. So we'll essentially start by adjusting the color of each layer separately, and this will allow us to derive correct specular values. So for instance, this gray paint will reflect some lightning, but dirty areas like this one here will not be reflective. Windows, on the other hand, will be very reflective, so we'll have to adjust our layers and their brightness to communicate that. Okay, so now I'll go and start doing that. So first I'll go and adjust this gray paint. So I'll go and modify the brightness of those two layers. Okay, I'll make it slightly darker because we don't want this area to be very reflective. This is paint, so it should be slightly shiny, but not too much. Okay, so now let's also go and let's adjust this base metal underneath. So I'll go and make this one a lot lighter. It's raw metal, so it's supposed to be more reflective. So I'll go and adjust the brightness of this layer. And I'll simply go and increase it really high. Maybe let's do it once more. We can always tweak those values later, but I just wanted to stand out from this gray paint. Let's keep that very supple. Okay. And as you can see, all those chipped areas are slightly brighter, so they'll pop out a bit more in CryEngine 3. Okay, now next, let's also go and let's make the glass slightly brighter. I'll go to Image, Adjustments, Brightness Contrast, and I'll simply adjust it 2 times, like this. Okay. Alright, and this will basically make the glass much more reflective than any other element in our texture. So when we apply cube maps in CryEngine 3, the windows will reflect the environment. Okay, so now let's maybe go and let's adjust the brushed metal as well. This one will be also slightly darker than the other elements, but I think I'll maybe go and lower the brightness of this layer a bit, like this. Alright, basically I don't want this metal to be too reflective. Okay, so next, let's maybe go and let's darken those screws a bit. So I'll go to blending options, and then I'll simply choose our color overlay, and I'll simply change this color to something darker. Maybe like this. Okay. And yeah, that seems to work. That makes the screws a bit more dull. Okay, now let's go and let's adjust the red paint as well. Okay, so right now this strip is very saturated, and if we were to use it like this in our specular map, this part of our material would look very metallic. And as a general rule of thumb, all materials that conduct electricity feature highlights that share a very similar color to the diffuse, whereas non-conductive materials generally have white specular highlights. Now in this case I want to make this paint look a tiny bit metallic, but I want to keep that effect very supple. So we'll have to go and lower the saturation of this layer, like this. Okay, and now let's change the blending mode to normal, and lower the opacity down to maybe something like 70. Okay, now let's also go and let's increase the brightness of this layer. I'll try to make it a bit brighter than the gray paint. Okay. And yeah, that seems to work correctly. So this will basically make the highlights on the red paint slightly lighter than on the gray paint, and will give them a very supple red tint, and that will make them look slightly metallic. Okay, so now let's go and let's add some depth to our specular map. So I'll go to the lightning group, and I'll go and set its opacity to 100%. Now here I'm gonna go and bump the highlights to the maximum, and that will make the details really pop. And next I'll go and adjust the AO broad. I'll set it to maximum as well. And yeah, this will basically darken those areas around the edges and make them less affected by the light. Yeah, that seems to work. And here I'll go and change the blending mode to linear burn, and then I'll drop down the opacity a bit. Yeah, that should do, I think. Basically, we don't want those recessed areas to be affected by the light too much. So by bumping our AO maps, we can get rid of the lightning in the crevices. Okay, so now we're gonna take care of this rust and the damage. And basically, we want those areas to be very dark and desaturated, because the rust is not conductive. And also the highlights in the dirty areas have to be much weaker. So what I'm gonna do is I'll simply go to this photo overlay group, and I'll switch the blend mode to luminosity. And now as you can see, all those areas are pretty much desaturated and dark. Okay. Now I think our specular is still a bit too clean, so what I'm gonna do is I'll go to this photo overlay dirt group, and I'll simply go and increase the opacity to 100%, and then switch the blending mode to difference. And as you can see, this instantly makes the dirt a lot more intense. But yeah, that seems a bit too strong, so maybe I'll go and change the opacity down a little bit to something like, yeah, something like this. And basically we want the dirt to be visible, but we don't want it to be too strong. Okay, now let's maybe go and let's change the color of this overlay that we have on the gray paint. So I'm gonna go and find this layer, and basically we're gonna change the hue a little bit, and we're gonna reduce the saturation to make this part of our material look a bit less metallic. So I'll go and tweak it a bit. I'll maybe make it slightly blue like this, and I'll go and reduce the saturation as well. Right. Okay, now let's also go and let's tweak the intensity of those low frequency values. So I'll go and increase the opacity of this one. I'll make it a bit stronger like this. Okay, that should do it. And I'll do the same here. And yeah, I'll make those highlights much stronger like this. This will basically make them pop out a lot more and give our specular a bit more depth. Okay, now let's go and let's tweak our specular map a bit more. So basically I think I'm gonna go and reduce some of those noisy details on the windows. In fact, I'm gonna go and remove all of them. So I'll go and select this glass layer, make a selection from it, and then I'll click on this group here and I'll make a mask. And this gives us the opposite effect, so I'll go and press Ctrl I, and this will basically invert the mask. Okay, so now let's maybe go and let's drop the opacity of this group down a little bit to 50. Okay, let's zoom in, and yeah, that makes those noisy details a bit less intense, and I think that will work quite nicely. Okay, so now let's maybe go and let's add some unique details to our specular map, because if we just leave it like this, it won't actually do too much. So what I'm gonna do is I'll go and add some vertical strokes that will basically look like the strokes of the brush that had been used to paint those door. So I'll go and I'll create a new layer in this painted metal group here. Okay, I'll go and rename it. I'll call it brush strokes. Okay, and now I'll go and select a brush and I'll choose this flat brush here. Now I'll set the opacity to something low, like this. Okay, and now I'll simply go and start making some very quick vertical strokes like this. I'll just keep doing this very randomly and very quickly. Same on the other side of the door as well. And basically I'm just gonna try and fill this whole door. As for the top parts, I'll try to place them maybe horizontally, like this. And don't worry too much about making mistakes like this. Just keep painting anyway. Okay. And that's pretty much done. Right, so now I'll zoom out, and I'll simply go and add a few strokes in those empty areas. Okay. Right. Now I'll simply go and change the blending mode of this layer to overlay, and I'll drop down the opacity down to something like this. And now as you can see, it not only makes those door a bit brighter, but all those strokes are still fairly supple. And when we bring this material in CryEngine 3, it will look like the strokes appear when we shine the light on it. Okay, so now let's maybe go and let's also add some details to this glass. Basically, I'm gonna go and add some pattern that will seem to be painted on the windows. So I'll go and create a new layer above this one. Okay, now I'll go and choose the paint bucket tool, and I'll choose this pattern option here. Now here in this menu, I'll go and I'll choose this grid-like pattern that can be found in the patterns section. Now I'll simply go and fill the canvas with it. Then next I'll go to edit transform, and I'll simply resize this pattern down to 25%. I'll adjust it a bit, and I'll go and rotate it by 45 degrees. Okay, now let's commit. Alright, now I'll simply go and use the marquee tool to delete the excess of this pattern. so everything almost fits within the windows. I'll delete this part here as well. Okay. Now press Ctrl J to duplicate. Alright. I'll move it to this side. Let me remove this little bit. Okay, and I'll just simply go and duplicate it again. Okay. And one more time. Alright. I'll leave the bottom windows as they are. Okay, now let's merge those layers. And I'll simply go and make a selection from this glass layer. I'll select this one and create a mask to remove the excess of information. Okay, now let's maybe go and let's give this layer a bit more texture. So I'll go and choose the soft brush. I'll keep the low opacity. I'll make my brush a bit bigger and I'll start painting the mask. Maybe let's increase the opacity. Okay, and I'll just keep on adding some strokes around the edges of those windows. Like this. Just make sure that your mask is selected. So I'll just keep on doing this. Okay. And I'll go and do the same thing for each one. I'll just keep on doing this very, very randomly. Same here. Okay, so that's done. Right, now let's also maybe go and let's add a second layer. And I'll use this one to add some dirt to the windows. So I'll maybe use this color. Maybe let's reduce the opacity. And also go and start adding some very soft strokes in the middle of the windows to darken them a bit. Like this. I'll just keep this very, very random as well. Okay. And same here. Right. And finally I'll go and do the same here, but I'll make my brush smaller. Okay. Right. That seems to work fine. But maybe let's go and let's drop the opacity down a bit. That will work. And I will also do the same thing here. I'll drop the opacity. Okay. Okay, so let's zoom out. And yeah, that seems to work good. So at this point we're pretty much done with our specular map. But before we finish, I like to do one thing. So I'll go and close all those groups. I will select all of them. And I'll simply go to Layer, Duplicate Layer, OK. And I'll merge them all together. Now I'll simply go zoom in a bit. I'll go to Filter, Sharpen, and I'll sharpen it once. And now as you can see, all those details seem to pop out a lot more. But generally I don't really like my specular maps to be so noisy. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Surface Blur to reduce some of those noisy details. So I'll go to Surface Blur, and here let's tweak the settings a bit. So I'll simply go and adjust them a few times and see what works best. Let's maybe try this. And yeah, as you can see, we still have some of those dirty details, but they seem to be much less noisier than before. And this will make our specular map look slightly more appealing. And we'll give it a bit of a style. Okay, so now let's go, let's click OK. And that's it, our specular map is done. Right, at this point you might want to preview your results in nDo, but we won't be actually doing that. And that's because our material will look totally different in CryEngine 3, because we'll be using the specular map with all kinds of cool effects that CryEngine supports, like real-time reflections, cube maps, and so on. So we're going to test our specular map there, and if we need to, we'll make some adjustments. Now in the next chapter, we're going to put everything together. We'll export our textures into CryEngine 3, and then we'll set up the material, and we'll basically try to preview it. So see you in a second.